In the early days of World War II, the United States and her allies took a beating in the air from the superior planes and pilots of the Axis forces. Allied commanders knew it would only be a matter of time before they would overcome the Japanese Zeros and the German Messerschmitts. They had first-class fighters and bombers on the drawing board and in the assembly plants. They just needed time to get them into the war. In the interim, air commanders turned to an old warbird that still could fly with eagles. That bird was the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. To many, the P-40 was like Rodney Dangerfield. It just didn't get any respect. But those who flew her knew that there was much more to her than meets the eye. In the early months of World War II, the P-40 kept the Allies in the war and the Axis off the backs of the ground troops. In aviation history, the P-40 has had an opportunity to set the record straight.
The P-40 is a much maligned and unfortunately denigrated airplane. It was a far better airplane than people think. It was a good, solid, reliable airplane. It performed very well in the desert theater. It performed very well in North Africa and Italy. It performed very well in the Southwest Pacific area and in China. And I think that had it been the only airplane that we would have available to us in the early days of the war, even through, say, the 1943 time period, it would have been acceptable in the European theater, although we would not have considered it as, say, equivalent to a Spitfire or equivalent to the latest generation of fighter aircraft development. But there were a number of Axis pilots who underestimated the P-40 and did not come home as a result of it.
The P-40 had a 37-foot wingspan with a total length of just over 33 feet. Its height was 10 feet 7 inches. It was powered by one Allison V1710 engine. It had a maximum speed of 343 miles per hour. It weighed 6,200 pounds empty and 8,300 pounds loaded for battle. With a ceiling of 38,000 feet and a range of 1,400 miles, it was never tops in any one category, and yet, with a good pilot, it could get the job done.
The P-40 was, as I mentioned, the Pacific was a major player both in the air forces of the United States, but also that of Australia, the New Zealanders, the British themselves, and of course in Europe or in the Russian front fighting, which of course could be European or Asiatic, depending on where one was. It was a very strong player in the force structure of the Soviet Air Force.
One of the earliest tests for the Warhawk was in the battle for North Africa. On November 8, 1942, 11 months after Pearl Harbor, more than 800 ships engaged in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. The plan called for tactical air support for the ground forces. Some of the air units were ferried from England to the Mediterranean by carrier. 70 P-40 Warhawks sat on top of a U.S. carrier. 25 more on a British carrier. The Allies liked this warbird and knew that the Curtiss P-40 could carry a 500-pound bomb as easily as a belly gas tank. It was both a fighter and a bomber. Inspired by General Jimmy Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, these land-trained fighter pilots were risking carrier takeoffs to get to Morocco because their planes were urgently needed. At 2- and 3-minute intervals, the pilots raced down the short deck and grabbed for air. The Allies cleared the decks and buzzed the carriers for luck. Then, the entire group headed for the already battle-scarred landing fields of French Morocco. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was in command. This was before he became Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Allied forces had rolled over the opposition and moved halfway across North Africa, only to grind to a halt because of the weather and a lack of supplies. The Allies were almost within sight of the Germans' big supply ports from Tunisia. However, logistics and mud dictated the decision. On General Eisenhower's order, positions were consolidated, and the attack was postponed indefinitely. The mountains, the roads, even the air seemed to ooze with 6 weeks of steady rain. No motor transportation. Only a few meager supplies got through. For once, like the foot soldier, air support, the umbrella for the Allies' ground forces, was stuck in the mud. The enemy was in much better shape. They had hundreds of planes operating from permanent all-weather fields. Their veteran, battle-trained Luftwaffe was assured of easy victory over the inexperienced American air units. Allied harbors and airfields were primary targets. Air defenses were weak, open for Stuka dive bombing and strafing. After plastering Allied supply harbors, they attacked airfields. Air units gallantly held on, while even the ground seemed to rise and burn under repeated attacks. The Allies suffered losses, and even as they rescued their wounded, new and faster ways were improvised to carry casualties to safety. The planes which had brought in high-priority supplies took out higher-priority men. They were attended by flight surgeons. With air evacuation, casualties were only hours from hospitals. But wounded men and Warhawks had to be repaired. American ingenuity went to work. Now the spark of new ideas made crude gasoline firebombs. The Allies rebuilt their strength. General Eisenhower had planned strategy with his ground and naval officers. The Allies worked out the best ways of using their combined forces. General Spaatz was named CO of the Northwest African Air Force. Generals Arnold, Royce, and Baratin visited the Allied outfits, the 12th Air Force Fighter Command, run by General Pete Quesada. Those in command were helping the pilots get on even terms with the Luftwaffe. A while back, the Allies nearly ran out of 500-pounders, but now they had plenty. Gasoline, rationed at home, meant life or death in the desert. A battle for supply was being won. The Allies were getting ready. Suddenly, on February 14th, Rommel's Afrika Korps attacked. At Kaserne Pass, Allied lines stiffened. After 8 days of attack, the Axis initiative was exhausted. It was at this point that Rommel quit his African command. For the Germans, this situation worsened. Gasoline shortages reduced air operations. Squeezed into a steadily smaller pocket, they prepared to evacuate planes and key personnel to Sicily. About 20 men could escape in one of their small aircraft. High above them, the Allies watched and waited. Something big was coming. The German escape plan was put in motion. Near Tunis rose a group of more than 30 heavily armored Me-109 fighters. They were to escort a large fleet of low-flying transports. The hop to Sicily was a shuttle run of about 100 miles, less than an hour. 100 strong, the transports stretched in a long line on the deck, headed for their Sicilian sanctuary. They didn't get very far. As soon as the 57th Fighter Group spotted them, Captain Jimmy Curl's squad of 13 P-40s dove on the Germans to split them up. The Allies had been chasing Germans since July 1942, but they never had a chance like this famous afternoon. Down below, the transports droned on. If their luck held, the Germans might make a getaway. Their luck ran out. The tail-end Charlies of the long escape line took their chances on getting back to their African airfield. Some of them made it the hard way. When the attack was over, the Allies had destroyed 58 transports and 18 fighters. From then on, the Allies sat over German airfields and dared the Luftwaffe to come up. But the Axis still had a trump card. The Afrika Korps blocked the way to Tunis. The Allies drove, seeking weak spots. Finding some, they shifted forces, building for a breakthrough. Montgomery's army hammered the Afrika Korps from the south. Allied artillery tried to give the ground forces a toehold around Tunis. But Monty's 8th Army was effectively pinned down by the Afrika Korps. On the morning of May 6th, they called for tactical air support. The weather was good. The Allies had gasoline and bombs, planes and men. The Allies were ready. The P-40 Warhawk was ready. The Northwest African Tactical Air Force drew up a schedule for an unprecedented air attack, the heavies in first, to give depth to the artillery barrage. The Allies concentrated on an area 4 miles long by 3.5 miles wide. The Allies had 12th Air Force bomber boys who had started in the muddy fields of Algeria. They were teamed up with 9th Air Force men who had eaten sand all the way from Egypt, 1,500 miles. Before 9 o'clock, the Allies had planned to fly more than 1,000 sorties. Anything that could take off went up in the corridor. The Allied fighter bomber boys, including the 57th Bomber Group, were about to sweep a road to Tunis. The Allies were using the experience gained in Egypt, slashing Rommel and El Alamein. At that time, the Allies were only a few. Now, they were hundreds, all grouped in a powerful package. General Alexander's armies were anxious for the air attack, which would mean a breakthrough. They didn't have long to wait. They blasted a channel from Megizel back to Tunis. 2 hours. Tanks and infantry had advanced as much as a mile. Resistance began to crack. Firebombs, which the Allies had tested in the Sahara, helped in the big show. The Germans, realizing their desperate situation, retreated to make a last-ditch stand. Finally, the Allied armies broke through. From here on, Alexander mopped up with fire. At last, the Allies could see Tunis. This was the first blush of victory, a year and a half after Pearl Harbor, only 6 months after the landing. Allied soldiers, tankmen, and airmen were liberators like the American Marines who had brought peace to North Africa more than a century before. There were salutes to liberty as tyranny disappeared. The citizens of Tunis cheered the crusade for freedom that now had a new champion, the P-40 Warhawk. A 250,000 prisoners, proved that Nazi invincibility was a myth. In the German defeat, the Allies learned the strength of joint unified command. Allied air power had destroyed enemy planes, guns, and ships, which paved the way for the final destruction of Hitler's once proud and powerful Afrika Korps. After the Tunisian victory, General Eisenhower reviewed the United Allies, who were at last above the mark. The world had seen the first large-scale application of complete air supremacy. The Allies had battle-tested and developed tactical air support for their ground forces. Future battles would show the lessons of the North African air warfare applied on a global scale, with steadily increasing manpower, plane power, and firepower from the United States Air Force. But were it not for the outstanding work of the P-40 and her pilots, this might have been a different story. Another theater of operation that felt the influence of the P-40 was in China, Burma, India. Known as CBI, it was all but ignored for most of the war by the major players in Washington. But for those who fought there, it was a battle of wits to make do with few supplies from home against a large Japanese force that had ruled the land and air for years. Flying into this area meant flying over the hump of Burma into dangerous Chinese territory. The P-40 was all the Allied pilots had to rely on, and they became experts at making the most of this fighter. For this was the land of the rising sun, and President Roosevelt sent a small but dedicated group to sink it back down to size. Beginning as the American Volunteer Group under Claire Chennault, also known as the Flying Tigers, it would eventually become the 14th Air Force. This is the end of the line for any hump pilot. He goes back to India for another load. The 14th takes over. Kunming was the first base of the 14th. One of the first jobs of its pilots was to defend their airfields and keep the hump route open. Here are some of the men who did that job. They are the original Flying Tigers. Former Army, Navy, and Marine pilots who came to China as civilians on a strictly business deal. $500 a month salary and a $500 bonus for every Japanese plane destroyed. From these original Flying Tigers came the 14th Air Force. Once official, they got planes, pilots, insignias, a commander, and a great tradition. The planes were battered P-40s with .30 caliber machine guns, museum pieces for the most part, but all they could get here in China. But the pilots were battle-wise veterans who now joined the Air Force as majors. The commander was the retired Army captain who led the Flying Tigers, now Brigadier General Claire Chennault. With this motley array of men and planes, they faced a ring of Japanese air bases from Upper Burma to Indochina, prepared to keep the aerial supply line over the hump open. Small wonder the Japanese thought they could blast these Americans out of China. The stakes were high when they tried. If they knocked out the Air Force, they could close the hump. Without the hump, China would be cut off and virtually out of the war. Again and again, the Japanese sent big formations of fighters and bombers against the American air bases around Kunming. Day after day, the red air raid warning balls went up, and the pilots scrambled for their sharp-nosed fighters. Japanese bombers bored in. Shark's Teeth pledged to attack with General Chennault's famous fighter tactics. But enemy losses were so heavy that the Japanese were forced to give up their attacks. With the hump bases safe, General Chennault planned to move into East China and take the offensive. With the help of the Chinese, the 14th was free to kick open the back door to Tokyo a little wider. The first jump was 400 miles east from Kunming to the Hanyang-Luzhou line, with major fields at Hanyang, Lingling, Gualing, and Luzhou. 250 miles closer to the Japanese, with the staging fields of Sichuan, Panzhou, Namyang, and Nanning. From these new positions, American planes could attack the Japanese along a wide arc from Shanghai to Saigon and as far east as the Philippines. Nowhere else in the world in the spring of 1943 could American air power strike so close to the heart of the Japanese Empire. Those who were there felt it was a miracle. In less than 3 months, these people built a chain of airfields that could handle a huge American force. They built them on the land that formerly raised their food. They built them by hand. Their pay was 20 cents and a bowl of rice a day, and the hope the Japanese would one day be defeated. As many as 90,000 people worked on a single field, from 8-year-old children to 80-year-old patriarchs. And women worked as hard as men. Each field posed a different problem. Here, rice paddies were drained. There, a river diverted from its course. Hills were leveled. These cones of earth measure the depth the workers dug and serve as the basis for their pay. These rocks were carried from a riverbed 2 miles away. The large rocks are laid by hand to form the runway foundation. Mortar of mud and water, called slurry, is mixed and poured over the foundation as binder. More stones are crushed and spread over the foundation to make the surface. More slurry is poured, and the stones are covered with sand. Half-ton rollers pack the stones. Add a ring of rebutments, and you have an airfield ready for action. The Chinese air raid warning that kept the P-40s from being caught on the ground was an old system. Chinese spotters, farmers, soldiers, magistrates, covered all the territory between the Allied bases and the Japanese. They flashed word of enemy air movements by telephone and radio. If a Japanese bomber warmed up on a Canton airfield, word often reached this fighter control center at Kualing before the plane could take off. The net also guided lost planes to safety. Chinese guerrillas saved many American pilots and crews who had to bail out behind the Japanese lines. No American stood guard, cooked, or carried. They built the Allies' quarters and did the Allies' housekeeping. Many Chinese with technical training joined the ground crews and helped keep American planes and equipment working. Finally, new American planes reinforced the battered P-40s and the dozen B-25s that were the bomber command. Long-range B-24s, cannon-carrying B-25s, and some P-51s. The American squadrons were joined by the pilots and crews of the Chinese-American wing. These Chinese airmen had been trained in America and now returned to their own country, ready for revenge. The 14th was still the smallest American Air Force and lived on a starvation diet of supplies. It took almost all of the increasing hump tonnage to keep the new planes supplied with gas, bombs, and bullets. This plane would be junked in any other theater. In China, it is patched with parts from other wrecks and is sent back to fight again. There is firefighting equipment that would have saved the life of this pilot, but it would have displaced a 1,000-pound bomb or 200 gallons of gas in the precious hump tonnage. These are the grim choices the 14th had to make. This is the hard way to refuel. Modern gas trucks and pumps couldn't squeeze through the hump bottleneck. Gas for motor fuel is diluted with 75% alcohol made in China. It's hard on the motors, but it saves hump tonnage. All this gas meant scores of dangerous hump trips and took weeks to accumulate. All of it was burned up in a single mission of one heavy bomb crew. This was also burned in a single mission, a Japanese mission. 15,000 gallons of gas and oil went up in this blaze when Japanese planes hit a supply train at Luzhou. Probably the best way to explain the shoestring on which the 14th operated is to realize that everything delivered to it over the hump during the first 6 months of 1944 could have been carried in 5 merchant marine ships. New supply problems were created by the move to East China. High-priority cargo still moved by air, but the bulk of supplies moving to eastern bases traveled in another patchwork system of trucks, a rheumatic railroad, and these streamlined carriers. Even Christmas came late to East China. It was March when these Christmas packages from America and Santa Claus reached Kualing. The Flying Tigers and the P-40 had to do the most with the least. One bomb in China had to do the work of a dozen elsewhere. To do that, you go down low and ram it home. Like that. That was practice. By the fall of 1943, the 14th was punching the Japanese from Indochina to Formosa. Shipping was the main target. The new bases brought the Japanese lifeline within easy range. This lifeline was the sea route from Japan through the Formosa Straits, down the South China Sea, the Dutch East Indies, and the Southwest Pacific. Oil, rubber, tin, and other raw materials moved north to Japan. Troops and supplies moved south to the Pacific fighting. As the Navy moved westward across the Pacific, more and more Japanese shipping was squeezed into the China Sea. The 14th's hunting grew better. As a result of these attacks, the Japanese realized that they had to drive the 14th out of China. 3 times they tried to knock the Americans out of their eastern bases. In the spring of 1943, the Japanese drove south from the upper Yangtze. In the summer, they tried an air blitz. In the fall, they went with another ground offensive around Tung Ting Lake. Each time, the combination of Chinese troops and American P-40s hurled them back with heavy losses. In the spring of 1944 came the Great East China Offensive. Their objective was to drive the 14th out of China, gain control of the Hangzhou-Canton Railroad, and fortify the China coast against the threat of landings by the Americans pushing westward across the Pacific. The 14th attacked with every weapon in its arsenal. Despite bad weather, fighters strafed troop columns with rockets, gag bombs, and machine guns. Many cavalry columns spearheading the drive were broken up by strafing bombing. All this cost American blood as well as gas, bombs, and sweat. Pilots flew their tired Warhawks 3 and 4 missions a day for weeks without end. These Japanese prisoners taken at Hingyang were thin and half-starved. They said no rice and little ammunition had reached them for weeks because of air attacks. American bombers and transports dropped supplies to the Chinese garrison by parachute. Then the 14th ran out of gas. Some fields had no gas. Some had just enough for one more mission. At others, gas was pumped from bomber tanks to keep the fighters in the air. Before enough gas reached the advanced fields, the Japanese had surged over Hingyang, never again to be halted until they had split free China. The Great Retreat was on. These refugees had long been a favorite target for Japanese pilots. But during this long trek, Japanese airmen declined to venture into American-held sky by day. No Chinese were killed by strafing or day bombing. General Chennault ordered pilots with their P-40s to go on special fighter patrols over railroad yards and other congested areas when Japanese air attacks seemed imminent. As the road wound up into the Kwazhou Plateau, some were literally on their last legs. Many of these people were captured by the advancing Japanese. Others were waylaid by bandits in the hills. Along the road to Kunming, refugees streamed past new airfields that thousands of other Chinese were building to give General Chennault's flyers new springboards of attack. In Burma, crack Chinese divisions were loaded into transports and flown to the crumbling East China front. They had American artillery, bazookas, mortars, machine guns, and plenty of ammunition, and had proved they knew how to use them in driving the Japanese out of North Burma. The Japanese were within 20 miles of cutting the Burma Road in China and overrunning the new American fields when these veteran Chinese troops, supported by air attack from P-40s, hurled them back 60 miles off the Kwazhou Plateau, down to the valleys of East China. The Japanese had started out in May to take the Canton-Hankow Railroad, occupy strategic coastal areas, and knock the 14th out of China. When they were checked in January, they had the railroad and the strategic areas, but they had failed to knock the 14th out of China. Even while they were fighting to clear China of the 14th, the Far Eastern Air Force and the Navy bombed the China coast from the Pacific. The Japanese lifeline was caught in a vice of American air power stretching around the world. More supplies reached the 14th as the first convoys traveled the Lido Road, opening the first land supply route to China in 3 years. From new bases all over China, the Flying Tigers renewed their offensive, and the Japanese well knew what the P-40 and a good pilot could do. History records the following. The Flying Tigers, with their worn-out P-40s, destroyed thousands of small supply boats and hundreds of locomotives, trains, vital bridges, supply dumps, and barracks. They destroyed 2,500 Japanese planes, killed 35,000 Japanese troops, sunk and damaged millions of tons of Japanese merchant shipping. That was the work of the Flying Tigers and an old warbird that didn't get any respect. The P-40 continued to make a contribution throughout the war. As the newer fighters came off the assembly line, they proved themselves to be more versatile in terms of range and speed. But the Warhawk was there when she was needed most. Rugged, ready, and able to fight with a good pilot in control, this plane gained its share of respect. Across Africa and Asia, and along the Eastern Front, the P-40 flew against the best the Axis had to offer and held its own. If you ask any combat pilot, he will tell you that that is all you can ask of a warbird.